My number 8 best chess game of the 1960s is Boris Spassky versus David Bronstein from the Soviet Championship of 1960. This is a King's Gambit, and it was featured famously in the James Bond film From Russia with Love. At the time of this game, I think that Spassky was obviously a huge talent, a future world champion, although no one could know it at the time, and Bronstein had drawn a world championship match almost a decade before. So you're really seeing two very different generations. Now, Bronstein is a famously creative player, but I think now we think of Spassky as a gentleman and a sportsman, the classical player in opposition to Fischer in 1972. However, throughout his career, he has played daring chess, including playing the King's Gambit in this game, against Karpov in the 80s, and against Fischer a few years later. Here, we really see him cut loose and demonstrate that daring reputation. As promised, Spassky opens the game here with e4, and after e5, we do get 2f4, the King's Gambit. Now, I feel basically every chess player gets a thrill in their heart when they see this move on the board. Obviously, it is not the soundest option available. Today, with modern computer analysis, it is harder than ever to play the King's Gambit, but it certainly leads to an exciting and a dramatic game. In this case, the chosen response, and there are obviously many, as has been well pointed out by Nigel Short, but the chosen response in this game is e takes f4. I do think that this is the best option available to black. After capturing, and white plays knight f3 here, stopping queen h4, the only other option is bishop c4, the bishop's gambit version, which has been played in very interesting games. After knight f3, there is a choice of options, but I definitely think that capturing the pawn first is your best bet. Now, in the later game that Boris Spassky played against Bobby Fischer later advocated in a huge analysis for d6, which has been known as Fischer's defense. This is also how Anatoly Karpov actually played against Boris Spassky later in the 80s in a rapid exhibition game. In that game, we saw bishop c4, h6, d4, and g5. Now, I do think that this is one of the better options available to black. Black has the idea of putting the bishop on g7, the knight on c6, and really putting pressure on the dark squares. And this strategy works very well with the pawn chain that black has built. h6 and g5 support the fianchettoing of the bishop, and they hold on to the extra pawn on f4. Now, I like to play against this by playing g3 at some point in slightly different versions of this, but I do think it's a very reliable option for black. In this game, though, Bronstein goes for d5, immediately giving the pawn back. Now, this is a good option too, but after pawn takes d5, I don't think he plays it the best. He plays the move bishop d6. So he's given the pawn back, and he has the idea of developing a bit and holding on to the pawn on f4. But now material is equal, and the bishop is getting in the way of the queen that could put pressure on the d5 pawn. Probably a better option is knight f6 here to try and pick up the pawn quickly, and if, for example, white tries to hold on to it with c4, then c6, and black can turn this into a gambit with very, very good chances. This can quickly get very dangerous for white. He really should not hold on to the d5 pawn, not capture on c6. So after e takes d5, bishop d6 in this game, we see knight c3, knight to e7, also not a very good option, I think. I understand the idea of putting the knight on g6 in some lines and really holding on to the f4 pawn, but is the f4 pawn worth all of that? I think the answer is no. Spassky continues naturally, and this is one thing that Fischer later commented was very difficult about playing Spassky. He would lose material, and then he would just continue playing as if it didn't matter, and this really tripped Fischer up. Sometimes when players lose material or they've gambited material, they start playing kind of in a bit of a conservative mindset somehow. Their style changes. If they feel like they're getting, outplayed, they start playing for a draw. Spassky never does that. He keeps active, and he's going to do that in this game. d4, castles, bishop to d3, knight d7, and castles from white. At this point, Spassky has very strong ideas like knight e5 and knight g5, so Bronstein plays the move pawn to h6, which at least stops knight g5. However, when you're playing moves like h6 in a gambit opening where your opponent is really achieving a lot of activity, I think something has gone wrong, and White's next strong move really drives home that point. Spassky plays the move knight to e4. Now, this does a lot of things, including freeing the c-pawn, which is going to be useful in many lines, as we'll see. It also has the idea of simply taking on d6, and then after pawn takes, capturing on f4. Now, this is not just getting the pawn back, because black already gave the gambit pawn back with d5, so material on the board is equal. White is just threatening to win a pawn here. After knight e4, we see knight takes d5, so black is a pawn up for the moment, but now c4, expanding in the middle of the board, and white's pieces are really starting to flow. At this point, the knight needs to move, so it hops into e3, it gets snapped off here, and of course, this pawn might be dead in the water. However, we don't need to go try to win that pawn too quickly. Let's continue focusing on expanding and pushing black back. Pawn c5. At this point, the bishop only has two squares. You might think about the greedy bishop f4, trying to hold on to this pawn, hoping that maybe the pawn is going to be a bone in white's throat, although probably white has good ways to work around that. But white also has an immediate tactically strong move. That is g3. The bishop is running out of squares. After bishop g5, knight takes g5, pawn takes g5, queen h5, ideas like knight takes g5 are just over. This is completely winning for white, +7 according to the engine. So after c5, the bishop needs to fall back to e7, certainly a very sad square, but there is no better choice. Now bishop c2. This move has a very direct threat, but being very direct does not mean that the threat is not strong. Queen d3, the knight moves, and then queen to h7 and checkmate. Bronstein plays rook e8 with the idea of possibly freeing this square for the king to try to run, and more directly allowing knight f8 so that h7 can be covered. After rook e8, queen d3, and the threats are piling up. Bronstein tries a very clever idea here, e2. He knows he can't possibly hold onto this pawn, so he's just trying to get Spassky to slow down for a moment, capture the pawn on e2, move his queen off of the dangerous diagonal where it's lined up with the bishop, and line it up for some possible tactics on the e-file where Bronstein's rook is. Now, there is actually nothing wrong with queen takes e2. This is very strong for white. It's also been pointed out that rook f2 and then rook takes e2 is excellent as well. So white has many good choices. But it's the move played here that makes the game famous. So I encourage you to pause your video and try to play like Boris Spassky. What move would the daring, young, energetic Spassky play in this position? Well, Spassky played the dazzling move, knight to d6. Objectively, this is not the strongest move, but this is the kind of move that we play chess for. What a brilliant idea. Spassky is offering up the rook with check here and offering up his knight on d6. All for very, very scary mating threats over here on the king's side. Now, after knight d6, the first question that you must ask here is, can you take all the material and get away with it? And actually, you kind of can. Now, after pawn takes rook here, and we can make a rook or a queen, rook takes on f1. In this position, of course, you can't capture the knight with the pawn because of queen h7 and queen h8 mate. Okay, fair enough. But after bishop takes d6, the king can get away to the e7 square. Now, the following play is very forcing. There's queen h7 check, king over to f8, pawn takes d6, which covers this mating square, so there's an idea of mate now. So pawn takes d6 back, queen h8, king e7, and rook e1. The king cannot run to f6 here. After king f6, the rook on e8 falls, so you must block. Rook e1 check, knight e5. Now, this knight is pinned and won, but also the queen is hanging on h8. So queen takes g7, pretty much forced here. Black at this point does have some choices, but one natural choice is rook g8, queen takes h6, and then bishop e6, developing and closing down the e-file. At this point, white can capture on e5, and white is down in exchange, but obviously black's king is not safe. What is the computer evaluation? 0.00. Of course, in a human context, the 0.00 evaluation is pointless. Anything can happen from here, but this is definitely the way that Bronstein should have defended. He should have been greedy and taken all these pieces. Instead, after knight to d6, he panicked a little bit and he errs right away. He plays the move knight to f8. Now this move does cover the h7 square, and it also maintains the idea of taking here and taking here. So black is still going to win material, right? Well, he missed one move. The only move that works for white, but it's crushing. This is another great opportunity to pause your video and try to play like Boris Spassky. Spassky's move here is knight takes f7. Boom! This move crushes the black position. Honestly, it is quite surprising that Bronstein missed this, but it seems like he was flustered after the brilliant move knight d6, and who can blame him? In this position, black really doesn't have a choice anymore. It's time to capture as much material as you can, and e takes f1 queen check is played. Now, after rook takes f1, the question is, can you take the knight? Because if you can't take the knight, then your position is really without hope. You need to capture the knight on f7. But after king takes f7, white is winning actually in multiple ways. I think nice is knight g5 check, king g8, and the most direct move here is bishop to b3 check. Yes, it's the most direct. But if you really want to be sassy about it and make things take a little bit longer and finish a little more prettily, you can insert the move queen h7 check, which doesn't really change the basic idea, but it does throw away the queen so that the final mating position, where the knight hops to f7 and then over to e5, note that the blocks on the light squares don't matter because you just take it, it doesn't change anything, leads to king h8 and knight g6 mate. A critical mating position and a beautiful mating position, the kind of mating position that we all play chess for. So after rook takes f1, in this position, we can pause for a moment and assess a few other options. I should point out the idea of queen d5 right here. After all, black is up a rook in this position. Now, bishop b3 immediately is very strong, but you could also go for the move order knight takes h6 check, because if g takes h6, bishop b3 is a pin of the queen here. It wins the queen, and white is easily winning in the resulting position. And if you choose not to take the knight here and you move the king over to h8, then lots of good choices exist. One is knight e5 with the idea of getting into f7. You also have sometimes maybe even queen h7 leading to some smothered mates. And of course, rook takes f8 is on the table. So these are very nice options. Instead of queen d5, you might also consider here bishop e6, but white can just either take the queen and then bring up the knight to e5. That's strong enough. White has material equality and a continuing attack. Or you could just play knight 3 to e5 right away. That's a very dirty engine line, but it does work as well. So after rook takes f1, what we actually see here is bishop f5, bringing the bishop out, giving it up to try and activate some pieces so that after queen takes, the queen trade can be offered with queen d7. Now, black is still up 1 point of material here. He's up in exchange for a pawn, but it should surprise no one that the attack on the light squares is just decisive very quickly. So after queen d7, we see queen f4, just pulling back and holding onto this knight. Bishop b3 is coming. Bishop f6, knight 3 to e5 first, but then after queen e7, we do get bishop b3 on the board. After bishop takes e5, knight takes e5, king h7, and queen to e4 check, Bronstein did resign in this position. Of course, there's not been any good options along the last few moves for him. Why did he resign in this position? Well, after queen e4 check, if you go back to h8 or if you play pawn to g6, the response is the same. You just need to eliminate the knight on f8. Rook takes f8 is coming, and that means that the g6 square is going to be the critical winning square for white after queen takes or rook takes, knight to g6, and king up, knight takes f8, double check, king back, queen h7, and checkmate. I hope that you've enjoyed this game as so many players across the generations have. If you like this game and you want to see more of the best chess games of the 1960s, then simply click on the playlist that is popping up on your screen as I speak.